My name's Megan Broughton. I'm a regional analyst at Intelligence Fusion, and I'm going to be talking about the White Lives Matter movement and white supremacy across the US. So in the early 2010s, the White Lives Matter movement emerged almost as an oppositional movement to the Black Lives Matter movement. As the Black Lives Matter movement started to gain traction following the killing of black men by police, an alternative organisation started growing out of a lot of white supremacist groups who directly started to oppose the Black Lives Matter movement. So the White Lives Matter movement is a sort of poorly organised, almost an umbrella group. A lot of interest comes from groups such as the Proud Boys and the KKK, who have involvement, and loosely they've all sort of gathered under a lot of social media channels such as Telegram, which is an encrypted messenger platform where a lot of groups can join and send partially anonymous messages under various pseudonyms. It's quite a broadly poorly organised group of people where you've got a lot of groups like the Patriot Front, conspiracy theorists, which largely gathers around the concerns of the sort of white replacement theory, where the white race is supposedly under attack from migration policies, falling birth rates, and social and economic policies which may influence the racial balance of politics and employment. Basically, a lot of members embrace conspiracy theories and sort of talk about these in online channels. One in particular where a lot of members have gathered around the idea of the George Soros funding caravans of Central American immigrants, allegedly, which has sort of led to a lot of anti-Semitic beliefs. So on the whole, it's a very poorly organised community. The majority of members sort of gather around social media sites and particularly on Telegram channels. You have various channels where they'll organise marches and discuss sort of politics, but in many cases a lot of the channels get infiltrated by Antifa and other oppositional groups. So it's quite rare for rallies to actually be organised these days because they have to announce the locations very last minute. And in many cases it means that few people turn up, or that the counter-protesters have already organised to show up and outnumber White Lives Matter. For example, on the 11th of April, many regional groups of White Lives Matter tried to organise a series of protests. Perhaps the most significant one was at Huntington Beach, where only about 10 people showed up, and there were about 500 counter-protesters because Antifa had leaked the location, and you'd already got a lot of sort of counter-organisation in place. There have been other incidents, say at the Arizona Capitol, where armed members of White Lives Matter have shown up, but again they've been either outnumbered by counter-protesters, banned by police, or decided to disperse shortly after gathering. So the majority of rallies have been quite unsuccessful. The other thing that seems to be seen quite frequently is the vandalism of Holocaust memorials and war memorials, often with swastikas and Nazi imagery. The risk posed by these groups is quite complex in that on one hand you've got a load of poorly organised groups gathering. The majority of attacks and incidents are very small scale. Lots of protests have occurred where only about 10 members have shown up, particularly because they're so poorly organised, and many online channels get infiltrated by Antifa, and they're forced to reveal their location of the protest at a very short notice. However, you also have had some more significant incidents where White Lives Matter affiliated groups have taken part in the Capitol storming of 2021. There was a lot of white nationalist imagery brought to the riots, and groups such as the Proud Boys were involved, and many individuals who were wearing white supremacist clothing, displaying icons, banners, and sort of on a larger scale you do sort of get a lot of lone wolf attacks gathering around this sort of core set of beliefs, such as the El Paso Walmart shooting, where it had the perpetrator had a particularly anti-immigrant sentiment and targeted migrants primarily from Mexico. So going forwards, it looks like groups such as Antifa are continuing to sort of pin down a lot of White Lives Matter tactics and far-right tactics, and will continue to disrupt their protest activities. However, when spontaneous gatherings occur and when lone individuals attack, that I think the main problem is a lot of these lone wolf incidents just cannot be predicted. Even in the El Paso shooting, a manifesto wasn't posted online until right before the attack happened. And even then it was just sort of, it didn't preempt the attack. With the new Democratic presidency, it's likely that attacks and incidents may be a bit more spontaneous, given that before they often sort of gathered around particular Republican events, such as the Capitol protests. There's the potential that a lot of these incidents could be a lot more reactionary to potential democratic policies with regard to migration. Earlier, I think the movement gained a lot of traction from a lot of Trump's anti-immigrant policies, such as the so-called Muslim ban and the growth of the border wall. Whereas now funding is winding down for that, there could be potentially more militant responses. Within the far-right circle, there is obviously the circulation of White Lives Matter material, and particularly with further protests across, say, Milwaukee with the Black Lives Matter movement, there is the chance that reactionary events will occur, and there is the sort of risk that a lot of people will get recruited on the grounds that they just want to oppose the initial outrage of Black Lives Matter. Originally, a lot of the groups were sort of incentivized by the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement, and obviously that's still quite significant to this day. And I think there's a slight concern that people opposing that movement, or potentially even just on a more loose basis, expressing discontent at, say, the rioting or perhaps the sentencing of Derek Chauvin, might potentially be vulnerable to being recruited by the wider White Lives Matter movement, which could potentially lead to greater membership and make them more mainstream, as the majority of members remain largely on the outside of mainstream politics. So increasingly with the Biden administration, a lot of Trump's anti-immigrant policies, which were very popular amid members of the movement, are either being undone or drawn back, such as the border wall funding. So there's the potential for reactionary responses to that. On the other hand, it could mean that a lot of the movement dies away as they realise they're no longer having the impact that they thought they were.